Good morning, Jessica.
Hi,
Hi, it is nice to meet you and see you.
I know you too.
Hi,
I was just wondering, do we present from our computer or will you present?
you're welcome to present on from your own computer because I know that way it'll be easier for clicking through.
Okay,
So
great.
you're able to do that. If you want to try, you should have the ability to screen share, but just if you want to double check.
Okay. Joe, do you want to share from your computer? Okay, perfect. And Sarah, we start at 11:15, right?
Yes, we do.
Okay, so we'll wait a little. Thanks everyone for coming so far.
And I want to make sure I have everybody's name. So I have Jessica Rosenberg,
Mhm.
Ellen, is it Baker?
Soccer.
Bacher,
Mhm.
and then Joanna Sosa. And from the Schuler Scholar Program, correct? Right, we'll just wait a couple minutes and then we'll get started.
Good. I'll go on mute for now.
Is everything okay with the way the screen looks right now?
Yeah, it looks good for me.
Okay, great.
Thanks, Joe.
And Jessica, just for my reference, do you prefer to take questions at the end or throughout the presentation?
I don't know if we have a preference. We're kind of layering information, so it might make sense to wait until the end, because we're talking about like different parts of a process. But if there's anything urgent, we're fine with it coming up in the middle.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks for asking though. Good morning. So different being online versus in person, but thanks for coming.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this session. My name is Sara Espinosa. I work for the Illinois Student Assistance Commission. Just a couple of housekeeping items. Please note that this session is a Zoom meeting, so you're welcome to stay on video, but please remain muted throughout the session. We will hold questions until the end. Please use the chat to share a question, and we'll get through whatever questions we can. We'll try to get through all of them this morning. We do encourage you as an organization to rename yourselves if you are able to. So rename, include your name and then your institution and also your pronouns. And that's just something that we encourage for all of our programming and throughout the rest of the day as well. This session is being recorded, and this question has come up quite a bit, but session recordings will be posted on the website, on the Sharing the Dream website as well, after the conference. And with that, I will turn it over to our presenters. This morning, we have Jessica Rosenberg, Ellen Bacher, and Joanna Sosa from the Schuler Scholar Program.
Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. Let's go ahead and get started. So again, my name is Joanna Sosa. I go by Jo Sosa. My pronouns are she and ella, and I'm the Manager of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Schuler.
I'm Jessica Rosenberg. I use pronouns she, her, and I am the Assistant Director of College Counseling here at Schuler.
Hi everyone, I'm Ellen Bacher. I use she, hers pronouns, and I'm the Senior College Counselor with Schuler at Waukegan High School.
And at Schuler, we are a college access program in the Chicagoland and Milwaukee areas. And we serve primarily low-income, first-generation students of color. And what we do is we guide them in gaining access to highly selective colleges and universities in the United States. Today, our goals are to discuss the barriers that undocumented and DACA students have encountered in the college process and our experience here, and also to share best practices in guiding students in working through those barriers in their college process. So we will dive into building college lists, college research process, college applications, financial aid, and more. And again, everything that we will talk about and share today is based on our experience in the Schuler Scholar Program, and Jess will dive a bit deeper into that next.
Thanks, Jo. So before we dive into our advice and best practices for working with undocumented students, I did want to give just a little more context to our program and how it has informed our work with our students. So as Jo mentioned, we work with students who are typically the first generation college bound in their family in the US. To attend college in the US, they're typically students of color, and they typically also come from lower income families. We do work with students who are both US citizens and who are also undocumented or DACA students. And we work with a subset of students who are very high achieving in their academics on their own merit. So the thing I want to dig into a little deeper first is the specific part of our mission that sets us apart from most college access programs, and that is our focus on helping our students gain access to and succeed at highly selective colleges. And I want to be clear upfront and say that highly selective colleges are not for every student. And I do want to acknowledge we work with, as I said, a small subset of students who are very high achieving, and we help open the doors to more opportunities by giving them additional resources, support, and guidance. But with that in mind, since students in our program only attend highly selective colleges, those are the ones that we're going to be discussing today, since they're the ones that we have the most experience with. So you might be wondering, why are we focusing on highly selectivity as part of our mission? So in order to get into that, let's first define what highly selective means. All colleges have different levels of selectivity that range from community college, who admit the majority of applicants, to the highly selective colleges that Schuler works with. And it really comes down to numbers when you're looking at selectivity on its own. The highly selective colleges that we work with typically admit roughly around 1/3 of the students who apply, or less, many less than 1/3. But selectivity on its own does not answer the question of why these schools are good for the demographic of students we work with. One other area we look at is graduation rates. The colleges and universities our students go to are able to provide highly individualized support and a wide array of resources in order to help their students be able to succeed and graduate at higher rates than other colleges. And at these smaller, more selective colleges and universities, students of color also have more opportunities to access those resources and supports that they need, and they're able to graduate at similar or sometimes higher rates than their white or Asian peers. And I apologize for having U of I on here. This is not a dig at U of I. It was just the information we had more readily available, but you can see Harvey Mudd College is an example of one of our colleges, and you can see the comparison of graduation rates by ethnicity. We also see similar patterns for students from lower income brackets. So at these smaller, more selective schools where our scholars have greater access to academic, financial, and professional resources, they're also graduating at significantly higher rates than their peers at less selective schools, as you can see in this chart. And to give some additional context to the work we're doing with students and families, these colleges that our students go to are all across the country, with the majority of them actually being on the East Coast, as you can see that heavy red in the Northeast. And for many of our students, this is out of their comfort zone, but we do work to expose them to these campuses throughout their 4 years of high school so that they're more comfortable going away from home. But it is an important part of the conversation as we're having that today. So now Joe is going to talk a little bit more about specifically how to work with undocumented and DACA students and how to help them get to selective colleges.
Thank you, Jess. So in our work, again, we have worked with both undocumented and DACA students in our program. And a concern that typically comes up with them for both just entering into the college process or even deciding whether or not they want to go to college is that they're not sure. They ask, why go to college if I don't know if I'm going to have a job after, right? Like, why should I invest in my education if I don't know for sure that I will able to have a job? And so, you know, this, among many, many other concerns, are for sure to come up during the college process. And they are conversations that you need to jump into very early. And answering some of the questions, like the ones I just mentioned, it is best practice to speak in general, right? And not to overpromise. So for example, if a student were to come to me and say, well, why go to college if I don't know if I'll have a job? I would say something like, well, having a higher degree can only be helpful in the future. Or perhaps they're afraid that they might have to go elsewhere after, they might have to go to their home country or somewhere else. And I would then say, well, a degree from the US is highly regarded anywhere you go. So whether you remain here and something happens to help your status or you have to go somewhere else, really investing in that higher degree from the US is investing in your future overall. I think the barrier of not knowing a student's status is, again, one that comes up for many. In our process, we typically find out in their application process to Schuler, right? Because they provide different tax documents and different things. Plus, we have some travel that happens during the first couple of years of their high school career. So typically we find out through those parts of the program about a student's status. But sometimes the student doesn't know that, or sometimes the student knows, but the counselor entering that process just doesn't know, right? So there are different ways to jump into that conversation. For us, we, again, like to start the conversation early because there are always those extra steps that we need to take with undocumented students and DACA students throughout their process, which is different than we would approach the process for our other students. So we typically begin our college list building process the second half of their junior year of high school. And that has given us enough time to enter these conversations that might uncover some of those challenges, such as status and other things like cost of college, concern about going away, etc. Right? So we have this junior survey that we put out there to students and their families, and we ask, what are the factors that might impact your college process that you would like your counselor to know about? And that has been helpful in uncovering some of those challenges for us. In order to open up this conversation, though, it's like super important that your students know that you're going to keep their information confidential, and that you will only share certain information with their permission and when it's absolutely necessary. So as such, it's best practice not to bring too many people into the conversation, and just keep it as much as you can between just a few people involved in the college process. Among all of the concerns that come up for our students who are undocumented in DACA are just concerns about travel, and especially because a lot of our colleges are outside of the state. Traveling has been a common concern that comes up year after year. For DACA students, it shows up in their concern about their families not being able to visit them at school, or visit schools that they're considering with them when they're going on these college visits to find out what they like about colleges, or when they actually attend, right? Being able to go to their graduation or visit them every so often. This is also a concern for parents and guardians, right? Not being able to respond to an emergency and be able to go see their students right away. So that is for DACA students. For undocumented students, there's a fear of travel of all kinds, air, bus, train, driving, right? Because of the concern that they might get pulled over, or that anything could happen, right? They might get questioned, and they might have to expose their status. So we recognize that these fears are valid and these fears are real, and it's important to affirm and educate students about their options so they can make informed decisions. So our students have been able to travel in a couple of different ways. Under 18, they have been able to travel with a high school ID as their identification to get on a flight. This has been super helpful for our students to travel to colleges during high school, during their college search. DACA students have been able to get Illinois state IDs and driver's licenses that they can use to travel. And undocumented students, those who do not have DACA and their families don't have access to a driver's license or a state ID. So, even though they could have an Illinois temporary driver's license, that was like a thing that was approved, right? On the card it says, it cannot be used for identification, so they can't use that for travel. And those students have been able to actually use their passport from their home country to be able to fly. But again, there's always that risk of someone asking too many questions and them having to disclose their immigration status. I want to say to all of everything that I just shared that it's important we recognize and acknowledge we're not legal advisors. So it's best practice to also redirect students to someone who's qualified to provide this type of advice and information. So when access to an attorney is limited, they can always go to their local organization. So the ICIRR, the Illinois Coalitions for Immigrant and Refugee Rights, is a good place to start because there will be links there to local orgs around the entire state of Illinois that they can seek legal advice and help with these processes. So thank you.
So now that we have a sense of some of those barriers, let's talk about the big one, which is being able to afford going to one of these colleges. And we wanted to talk about financial aid barriers first, because in order to build a well-informed college list, our undocumented and DACA students need to do some additional work to fine tune a list that they can work from. Even within our program, where we have a list of around 100, 120 schools that our students can apply to and attend as part of our program, our undocumented and DACA students really have to make that a much smaller in order for it to be feasible for them. So really for any student who needs significant financial aid to attend one of these colleges, regardless of their citizenship status. It's a tongue twister. There are a lot of barriers and misconceptions that they need to work through. So whether it's assuming they can't afford to go to a private or just simply out of state college, or assuming they can only apply to a select few, there's always tons of questions floating around when they think about affordability and financial aid. And some of those questions are up here. For our undocumented and DACA students, there are even more barriers to contend with. However, hopefully after this presentation, you'll agree with us when we say just because those barriers are there, it doesn't mean it isn't possible or worth trying for. And the number one barrier that really waterfalls into all other barriers is the fact that undocumented and DACA students are not eligible for federal loans and grants, meaning they do not get any money from the US government. And around $15,000 a year of students' financial aid comes from federal funding. So in order for a school to be affordable for our undocumented and DACA students, these colleges would need to fill in the gap of $15,000, give or take, every year with their own funding. And this increased commitment on the college's side does lead to unwanted barriers such as increased competition, reading students with a different lens, maybe being need aware versus need blind, and we'll go into that in a little bit, or only being able to afford to fund a limited number of students who need this additional funding. So before you can help them make a list that would be financially feasible, there needs to be some research done in order to understand financial aid practices and availability. So terms such as need blind and need aware are especially important to weed through for undocumented and DACA students because of the increased financial commitment from colleges. So for example, a school that advertises themselves as need blind, you cannot assume that they will also be need blind for undocumented and DACA applicants because of that additional financial commitment that falls onto the college. So in addition to knowing if a school can meet 100% of financial need, knowing whether they're need blind or need aware for this specific subset of students will also give you a better sense of how competitive that pool will be for admissions for these students. So I just wanted to quickly, for anyone who isn't familiar or anyone needs the reminder, the difference between need blind and need aware. Need blind means that the college does not consider the student's ability to pay in the admissions process, is it not factored in. Need aware means that they do consider their ability to pay, and that typically just comes down to how much money they have and how can they afford to fund everyone. It is not because they want to or don't want to. So for any schools on here that are need aware, I feel you, I get it. We know that it just comes down to the dollars. But this early education is very, very important. So on this next slide, you'll see a quick snapshot of a spreadsheet that we're going to share after this presentation. This is a list that we made with our own research. It's not exhaustive. And remember, it's coming from starting with our subset of schools that we work with. So there might be some missing here, but we still wanted to share it as somewhere to start. And it's also important that this is something that keeps getting updated every year as things are constantly changing. So this list that you'll see at the end has over 50 highly selective colleges. And in order to make this list, these schools all have to commit to meeting 100% of financial need for their undocumented and DACA students, in addition to the other students that are getting accepted. So that's the first layer that we went through to even be included on this list. We also only included schools on this list who had that information readily available. So you'll see on the right column, there's those links. Those links all go to a dedicated homepage with more information for undocumented and DACA students. If they say they meet 100% of need for undocumented and DACA students, but they weren't able to dedicate the resources or time to make that information readily available, we didn't feel comfortable adding them to this list to be shared widely. It doesn't mean that they don't do it. It just was one of those things that we wanted to make sure we were confident before sharing with you all and with our students. And we added some additional layers of information in order for everyone to get a better understanding of the amount of aid available. And that can give you a better sense of competition for admissions, which Ellen will talk about in a little bit as an undocumented or DACA student. So if I were looking at this list, the first schools I would prioritize would be the ones that are listed as need blind. The second layer of schools I would probably look at are the ones that say need aware, but they have that first checkbox of they fully fund all accepted undocumented students. And finally, the third layer I'd look at are those schools that are need aware, but they have a limited number of scholarship spots. Again, it could be a great option for students. It just means that it's going to be a little more competitive or difficult to get those spots. Not a bad thing, but it's just good information to have on hand. So once you have a list made for your students and you have a better understanding of schools' policies, it's important for families to get a sense of what their costs would be for out of pocket at a school that says they meet need. And in order to do that, they can complete the Big Futures calculator on the College Board's website. We do this with all of our students, not just with our undocumented and DACA students, but it's an option for them as well, because if a school is promising to meet need, you have to know what that need means. It doesn't always mean it's zero. For many students it is, but it is important to understand what that would mean for their specific situation. If your students are interested in schools that don't meet full need, so they're not on that list perhaps, but it is a really good fit for them, there are other ways that you can help fill in that gap. And we've listed a few programs that we know about here. This is not exhaustive. I'm sure there are more that we are not as aware of, but these are the ones that we've had experience with ourselves. And as you can see from the spreadsheet I shared, every school approaches the financial aid and admissions process differently for undocumented and DACA students. It is not a centralized process, and it can be difficult to navigate. That's where those links to homepages really come in handy, because you are going to have to keep track of, are you read as international? Are you read as domestic? Do I have to fill out this form or that form? Or is it a separate form? There are a lot of hoops to jump through, but if you're able to do that initial work for the students of finding the colleges and the information, hopefully that takes enough off of their plate to feel like it's accessible to be able to actually do the work to apply. So some best practices in general when it comes to working with undocumented and DACA students on their financial aid processes, they should never complete the FAFSA, even if they have an ITIN or a DACA number. They should not be completing the FAFSA. Sometimes some schools will require them to submit the CSS profile, and that's fine. They don't have to unless the school's asking them for it, because some schools will also have their own third-party forms that they want to fill out. Making sure you're looking for those specific landing pages directly for them so that they understand if they're applying as international or domestic and how they're read in the different policies. And also not being afraid to call financial aid offices for more information. And you can do that on behalf of your student. There's nothing wrong with having an anonymous call or also supporting your student with that call. I just saw a question in there. I would speak with the high school and explain the danger of having students complete the FAFSA. They might just not realize that it could impact their future in terms of applying for citizenship. I think it's considered a fraud, felony. Don't quote me on that. But it's not good practice, and they can't get federal aid anyway, and see if there's something else they can do. Okay, there's a waiver. Thank you. So now Ellen's going to talk through the admissions process.
Thanks, Jess. All right. Next, we're going to talk about some barriers, some best practices and guidance in the admissions process for DACA and undocumented students at highly selective colleges. And there's several barriers that we've seen. The first one being increased competition, as we mentioned earlier. Because DACA and undocumented students are not eligible for that federal funding, they often need more financial aid from the college itself in order to fill that financial gap and make the college affordable. So this increased need for funding means that colleges may have more limited spots available to these students, especially at colleges that are need aware for undocumented and DACA students. These students may also be read as international applicants instead of domestic applicants. which in itself also has less funding at times and therefore can lead again to greater competition in the admissions process. Another barrier is that students assume they can't apply early decision because of insufficient financial aid. As we said earlier, with all the different financial aid policies at each college for DACA and undocumented students, they assume they won't get the funding they need in order to make that binding commitment with early decision. However, we know that early decision can give students an admissions advantage by helping them stand out in the pool. Next is SAT and ACT scores. So in the past, these test scores were very important and students typically needed a higher than average score to stand out. Obviously now there's a lot more colleges that have gone test optional due to the pandemic, so this has somewhat gone away. There may also just be general confusion around application requirements. For example, a college might categorize a DACA or undocumented student as international and ask them to complete a TOEFL exam or an English proficiency exam. And often we know these students have grown up and attended high school in the US and they do not need to take the TOEFL. But instead they have to reach out to the college and ask for it to be waived, an extra hurdle in the process. And finally, students may be afraid of disclosing their citizenship status on their application. Students are unsure of how colleges will react to their status, if their application will be negatively impacted, or even if the college will report or share information with authorities. So for this reason, disclosing citizenship status is always the student's decision, always ask. Next, let's look at some guidance and best practices to help DACA and undocumented students shine in the process. So one big way to stand out in the application pool is by encouraging students to demonstrate interest through a variety of ways. One of these is interviewing with the college. Another is connecting with the admissions representative to make that personal connection. And this can be through a college admissions representative visit at their high school, an email, or a phone call. It's very important to note that applying early decision or action at these colleges that meet 100% financial need is still a possibility. As we mentioned earlier, students should of course complete a price calculator to estimate the cost and make sure they are comfortable, but they can be strategic. Encourage students to utilize both early decision 1 and 2 and focus on realistic options. Early decision and action can improve the student's chances of being admitted. If possible, students should visit the college or apply to flyouts as long as they are comfortable traveling. And students should have a variety of colleges on their list, which will help them stand out as well. So not only Ivy League colleges and having a mix of likely, possible, and reach options. Even though many schools are test optional now, students should still take the SAT or ACT because a high score could help them stand out. And finally, encourage students to highlight their strengths, identity, and what the student would bring to campus in their college essays. Students should not feel pressured to focus on their citizenship status as the main part of their identity if they do not want to. Counselors can help DACA and undocumented students during the admissions process in several ways. So they can help students design a spreadsheet or a note system to keep track of all these applications and all this research about the process. Counselors can also work with students to build their confidence and their self-advocacy skills by helping them connect with admissions and financial aid office, perhaps by joining or practicing a phone call, helping to draft an email, or calling schools and asking about citizenship disclosure. And as just said earlier, anonymous calls here are totally okay. Counselors can also help students learn when to share their citizenship status so they don't feel they have to tell everyone. For example, students should be cautious about writing about their citizenship status in emails versus calling about it. They should only share when necessary or when it feels safe. And students and counselors should be mindful of different reporting practices around citizenship at each college. Finally, this is how we help our DACA and undocumented students find a good college fit. So first, we start with the list of financially feasible schools that Jess shared earlier. Then we help them build a list of college factors that are important to the student, such as size, major, diversity, etc. We suggest they think about colleges in sanctuary cities and surrounding areas, as well as look for clubs and supports on campus for DACA and undocumented students. And if possible, find out if there are other DACA and undocumented students on campus, or perhaps there's a college contact they can reach out to. Students can read the campus newspaper as well to get a sense for how the campus leans politically. And lastly, we talk with the students about what the travel process might be and their comfort level, as Joe mentioned earlier as well. All right, so finally, this is a list of all the colleges our DACA and undocumented scholars have been admitted to. We typically have our undocumented and DACA students take advantage of early action, early decision 1, and early decision 2. And most of these were accepted in that early decision pool. So it's a little bit of a smaller list of acceptances to share, but still really exciting. And that is everything that we have for our presentation today. So we can conclude there and open up for any questions.
I see Tracy asked a question in the chat. For the schools that have full need funding but do not have a public statement, are you finding any reasons? How can IACAC members help advocate? I personally, and Ellen, you might have more insight into this. I personally haven't run into reasons why they don't have it on there. They are typically need aware schools as well. I didn't really run into any need blind schools who didn't have more information. So my hunch is that they're need aware and they technically will meet the need, but they're not admitting very many students every year because of funding issues. But that's my guess. Ellen, do you have anything to add to that? Okay. Where do you find if they're need aware or need blind on their website? Some schools will blatantly share it, and some schools it's more of our relationship with them and they've shared that with us in our conversations. But many schools will list on their website if they are need aware or need blind for both the general population and also especially if they read domestic students as need blind and international as need aware, which is a lot of schools. They will specify that when you're reading about whether or not they'll meet full need and how they read their students in admissions and financial aid. And Sarah, what's the best way for me to share the spreadsheet? Should I be putting it in the chat? Should I be sharing it afterwards?
You're welcome to share any files here via the chat, or if you anything else that you want me to add to share. If you're okay with it being posted on the website, then you can also feel free to send it to me via email.
Okay. I'm going to put it right here. Sorry, Kimberly, can you expand what your question means? Stateside application or international application? I'm not sure.
So I'm just going to take myself off the mute. I think that'll be easier than typing. So I find that sometimes with some of my students that are like on the bubble or in between, like they might have like a valid passport and things like that that allows them to travel. And they're able to do some of those visits, but they get into a pickle once it comes to the application. And some of the schools have advised them to do the international student application because they have a valid passport. But at the same time, they've lived, you know, in our country for a number of years, and then they might not qualify for the same scholarship. So I was just curious, kind of from your perspective, you know, what your students, you know, going through the scholars program have kind of experienced in regards to that. Have they been guided to do the actual direct application or the international or both?
So it actually, this is one of those things we were alluding to. It really depends on each college and how they read them. So that's why it's important to find that information on the website and always call if you're unsure, because if they are read as international students, there is typically that additional hurdle of saying, well, I went to high school here, I don't have to take a TOEFL. And so it's some schools, they're very well equipped to handle that, and you don't even need to advocate. And in other schools, they're not as familiar with the intricacies of it all. So unfortunately, it does depend on every college. So we don't recommend our students to go one way or the other. We always look at the college's application policies and how they're read, so that they're not wasting their time and doing one way and then having to do it a different way. So it does take a lot of work. Sometimes they don't always just get to do the same one form for every college, which is hard, but if they're willing to put in the extra work, it can really pay off. There are two more questions in here. The ED success rate of our students. How do you counsel students who have not seen campus? So that really has only been this year. As Joe mentioned, in the past, we were able to travel with our undocumented and DACA students because anyone under the age of 18 can travel with their high school ID. And so we had students who were US citizens using their school ID as well, especially in the city. They didn't have driver's license anyway. So they weren't standing out as a red flag, and we always check with their comfort level, of course. So in the past, that wasn't an issue. This year, it's an issue for everyone. We were still able to have a really high success rate with ED because we just really took advantage of the virtual visits and connecting with students on campus. It's not ideal. I would love to hear more from the students once they're there. Not only the ED students, but all of our students who haven't been able to visit. But connecting with real people on campus and having older students talk to younger students about what they viewed as the benefits of early decision has helped to build our momentum and our culture and feeling more comfortable with early decision. The next question, if they're not completing the FAFSA, are these students able to access you're welcome, Tracy, financial aid at some of our non-highly selective schools? Our focus has been on highly selective colleges, and most of those colleges use the CSS profile because the majority of the funding comes from the college and not from the FAFSA or the government. So I don't know if we're the right people to answer that, but it is a really good question to think about. Thank you, Joe. That's the CSS profile, and that's for institutional aid from colleges.
And some of the colleges will also have their own kind of like aside college process. So maybe their own FAFSA or their own version of the CSS profile that students can apply through. And then I guess the only caveat I would add to that is that the CSS profile costs money to send to schools. There are waivers like there are for the SAT, but that could be an additional hurdle too if they're not getting the waiver and they have to pay for every school that they're sending it to.
Yes, we can show that slide again. I also just read it out loud to you. It's not that long. It's Golden Doors, Quest Bridge, Dreamers Roadmap. It's a phone app. MALDEF, MALDEF, and Hispanic Scholarship Fund. I'm just going to put them in the chat. It's probably easier than sharing a screen. Any other questions? We have 5 more minutes, but no pressure at all. Thank you guys all for coming. I hope this was helpful. It's hard to get too into the weeds in 45 minutes, but if you have other questions that you want to ask one-on-one, we can put our emails in the chat as well. I don't know why I'm not able to show everyone, but Joe,
There is one more question.
do you mind putting the emails in the chat? For some reason, it's not letting me send to everyone. There's a few more questions. Sorry. Do you have your students fill out the alternative application? Can you specify what you mean by the alternative application? Is that for financial aid or for college admissions? The RISE Act. Oh, it depends on the school. Some colleges will ask them to do that, but typically the private schools don't. But yes, if it's part of the process for that college, then yes, they'll do it. Basically, we just have them do whatever the colleges are asking. It's not like our recommendation trumps what the college is asking for. And then how can families get involved in your groups? Oh, so sorry, we should have specified that. We work in specific partnership high schools throughout Chicago and Milwaukee. So the students have to attend those specific high schools in order to be part of our program. So I don't know if I'll remember all of them, but we are in Gwendolyn Brooks, College Prep, Lindblom, Math and Science Academy, Westinghouse College Prep, and Richard T. Crane Medical Prep in the city, and Sen, Nicholas Sen High School. And then in the suburbs, we're in Waukegan High School, Round Lake High School, Cristo Rey St. Martin, North Chicago Community High School, Highland Park, Maine East. I know Mundelein. I'm forgetting more, but we're in about 13 schools. The list does usually consist of reach, possibles, and likelies. Yes, that is the goal. First, we want to make sure they're all financially feasible. So that's why we start with that smaller list. And then we do treat them, the process as we would with any student. It's not just about being able to afford, because we feel we have enough schools for them to choose from. We're able to also look at fit factors and what they want in a college campus community beyond just being able to afford to go. So we'd like to add that additional layer for them so that they don't feel like they have, only a few options. Thank you. And Joe put our emails in the chat. So if you have any other questions, you can email all of us or one of us. Hopefully we can continue the conversation. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you to our presenters. Thank you everyone for joining the session. Don't forget, if you need PD hours, the link is on the Sharing the Dream conference website. You'll have to complete the form for every session you attend. And there is a networking room that will be open during lunch if you want to join and just chit chat. Nothing super formal or anything, just a space to sort of try to recreate the lunch that we would normally have in person. So just opening up a Zoom room to see if anybody wants to join in and chat. And thanks again to all of you for presenting and for your patience, because I know this was a session that was intended to take place last year, but with the pandemic, it didn't happen. So I appreciate your willingness to present this year. All right, thank you all again. Have a good rest of your day.
Bye, thank you.